He is a world authority on Nostradamus, of course, and a best-selling author. A number of books out there, including Predictions 2015 to 2016, Trump for President, Trump Strikes Syria, and some others we'll talk about in a moment. John, always a pleasure to have you on the show, my friend.
Great to be back on. It's been a while since we've done a few hours.
Oh, I got to tell you, strange times out there, Mr. Hogue. Strange times, aren't they? Can't you just feel the weirdness out there?
Yep, it's Hunter S. Thompson said that the world wasn't weird enough for him, but it's weird enough for me.
Well, it sure is. So let's talk about North Korea. Let's talk about prophecy. What do the signs all say?
Well, it's interesting that George W. Bush might have been onto something back in 2002 when he wrote his Axis of Evil speech, where he had the chief players, the top three, which was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, is actually something that Nostradamus predated and wrote about 440-plus years before in his Triumvirate of Terror alliance, a secret alliance of three nations, and he named them. One was an Eastern king. They're all Eastern kings because everything east of Provence, France, is where he'd used the word Oriental. Also includes, in the 16th century, people of the Middle East, but all the way to Far East. So the Eastern kings that would be overwhelmed by the great brothers of the North, which he describes in a French term after the constellation of Aquila, the eagle constellation in the northern skies, implicates Russia and America being those two eagle kings because of the American bald eagle and the double-headed eagle of Russia, which came into action in history once the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation was born in 1992. So what you then have here is a triumvirate of terrorist nations that these two, primarily the first brother, the Americans, annihilates, overwhelms. So if this prophecy is accurate, then if we're on the right interpretation, then we've already seen the first Eastern king, Saddam Hussein, destroyed. There is an intention, certainly with neoliberal and neocon circles inside Washington, which seem to have the president's ear since he launched missile strikes on a lesser country on the list of the Axis of Evil, Syria, is now looking towards confronting what may be the Eastern king, which is implied to be a great Mongol. Now, the Korean people are ethnically cousins of the Mongolians. So it could either be he's talking about the Kim dynasty, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and the current, I call him the young Un, the Kim Jong-un, the late 20-something new leader. Now it's possible that he is in line to be overwhelmed. So in a military action by one of the Eagle Kings. Now it's also important to know that the other Eagle King, the Russians, literally have a border with North Korea as well as China. The Vladivostok, the large port on the eastern Siberian coast, is just a few miles away from the northeastern corner of North Korea. So it definitely impacts them as well, and China. So the things are lining up, and especially astrologically, are also lining up for things to get pretty hot, pretty volatile from around July 14th on through September 6th because of an old nemesis of Nostradamus' predictions that I often commented on could be the window for war with Iran by the United States and NATO. That problem of the Mars in a fire sign, along with Saturn in Sagittarius, Mars in Leo, is the equally fiery period where raids and ambushes, that's terrorist attacks, could start happening and flaring up again, which could trigger. Last year, the window was very high, from August through the end of September. And although there was not a major war, the number one ally of Iran, Syria, saw the tide turn in the civil war with the fall of Aleppo to the Syrian government. That happened right at the end of that window. And then from there was launched sometimes with astrology, the things that hit in the world don't hit exactly while the stars are making their aspects, but as kind of an exhalation of breath afterwards. So what happened after that was in October, the large-scale urban battle since World War II, which is scarcely reported in the Western media, the Battle of Mosul, the battle to take ISIS out of the second largest city in Iraq. 1.6 million people are in that city, and the fighting is just tearing it apart, and probably untold thousands have died.
Oh, it's horrible.
Hundreds of thousands are on the roads as refugees. It's interesting to see the slant of the news, that people will focus on the 4-year siege of Aleppo, with the bias towards the Syrians and the Russians, with hacks that are never proved, but still, this is kind of ramping up a fever pitch. They will report about the abuse and the civilians dying in the crossfire in that siege, but 10 times more are dying now as we speak, as the battle reaches its climax in the old city on the eastern side of Mosul. And thousands of soldiers have also died, Iraqi soldiers, and it's not being reported. I find my sources through Iraqi sources and other news agencies we're not fairly reporting both sides of this.
No, we're not at all. I wanted to get your take, John, as we discuss this tonight, on the decision to fire the FBI director. Yeah, is there anything prophetic about this?
Well, yeah, in a way, it's similar to what happened one day. The president is saying, it has a similar sheen to it of surprise, surprise. I think I've been saying on your show when we talked about President Trump, Trump for President, astrological predictions, which I wrote like 13 months before the election.
Right.
Describe in detail how Trump could actually beat Hillary Clinton in an upset victory. And then I dabbled into a glimpse into what his presidency would be like. And I think this is exactly the thing you and I have been talking about in other shows, that Trump has a Gemini sun sign. He's born Gemini, and he has a Uranus, the planet of surprise and sudden changes, revolution, exactly over his sun sign, which in layman's terms means there's one thing that Donald J. Trump is going to be consistently doing for however long he is the president, and that is surprising us with his 180-degree decisions. I mean, one day he's talking about the Syrian leader should be decided by the Syrian people. 24 hours later, he's launching 59 Tomahawk missiles and saying the Syrian leader should be deposed. And suddenly, the man who was saying, we're not going to get into more ruinous regime change wars and keep America out of the military adventures that were a disaster in the Middle East. And then suddenly he's talking about getting into a full-scale war in Syria.
He talked about NATO. Now he likes it. He talked about NAFTA, how bad it was. Now he wants just to cut a better deal with Mexico and Canada and keep it. Yeah. So he does make these big changes. And
even he was having a wonderful meeting with the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, at the White House. It was an unplanned meeting. It was only supposed to be between Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Lavrov, but they actually returned the favor of what happened in last month when Tillerson went to Moscow and not only saw Lavrov, but several hours later he spent a couple hours with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing here is a pattern of action that it's dangerous, but it also has surprise in the fact that it might just make certain breakthroughs. For instance, now he's backed off from regime change in Syria. He's not talking about it. It's almost like he puts it out there, shakes everybody up. I mean, just like whether one agrees with what he said in his opening statement a few years back when he announced his presidency, when he mixed his metaphors and made it sound like every Mexican that was coming over the border was a rapist and a thief and all that. Although it's not really what he said. He's not too eloquent in the way he puts things out. And he later corrected it, but now the news has grabbed onto that.
Mm-hmm.
And but I mean, he did say one thing out of it that's quite true. He said, "Well, saying it right or wrong, I finally got the nation talking about it. We're now talking about immigration like it's never been talked about before." So the man, with that Uranus over his sun, is Mr. Shock Surprise. And he's going to give, in a strange way, I'm not even sure that he is conscious of what he's doing, because we've talked about his mediumistic powers, where his Neptune and his Jupiter and Libra, and the way it's aspected, he's basically a wide open channel. Now the problem is, who's he channeling? Up until the 6th of April, it didn't sound like he was channeling the deep state or the corporate interests, but suddenly he made a 180 degree, and it sounded like he was actually channeling Hillary Clinton, because a lot of his policies suddenly were neoconservative centric and neoliberal centric.
Well, his decision to get rid of Comey, John, was that basically, in essence, saying, Hillary, I'm sorry that this happened?
Yeah, it's another like shock and surprise move that says it without saying it. And it's got the poor Democrats scrambling, pundits just scrambling to try to make something wrong out of it.
They can't figure it out.
Well, I mean, it was a shock that happened in early April when suddenly you had left of center talking heads of CNN like Fareed Zakaria suddenly saying this was the day that Donald Trump became the president of the United States. And you have Brian Williams waxing poetic with poor, recently late Cohen, the singer, waxing about our wonderful weapons and stuff. And this is strange.
Hold on for a second, John. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back, and I do want to talk about Korea as well and how this all ties into prophecy. John, and I've got to tell you, you've got an amazing perspective on world events. Not only are you an expert in prophecy, but I mean, you're an expert in history too, and your perception of things that could happen are also based not only on prophecy, but on really knowing your stuff.
I try I've always been fascinated by geopolitical things since I was a kid, and I'm gratified to see that this new book, the reviews are coming in, and the general tone is that people are getting to see a whole deeper level of my giving background to why these things happen, why Syria happened, why is Korea on the verge of a bluff versus bluff between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. And one of the things I try to do is bring a fresh view, often the view of the other side that's maligned by the press, because in the 30 years I've been doing this, working with the press, I have never seen it worse in more amateur, more propagandistic.
And biased.
And so one of the more important things that I try to do, especially in this book about the Korean War, is that, for instance, you had another guest talking about how if North Korea lights off a nuclear test, it might start a military response.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that is a very U.S.-centric point of view of the situation, which is, unfortunately for most Americans, we don't actually talk to the Koreans. We don't actually find out why the North Koreans even started building bombs and why they did it when they did it. And so this book, when I shift from the Syrian conflict into studying the second half of the book, the North Korean situation, the first thing I do is a transitional chapter that says, let's dispel some basic myths about North Korea, about what is going on there, so that we can be enlightened enough to find a solution that doesn't kill more people in 1 week than perhaps even happened in World War II.
Right.
Not because it's a very condensed, militarized area of densely populated places, with 1.6 million North Koreans over the DMZ, and 660,000 South Koreans, with nearly 30,000 American personnel, and another 50,000 in Japan. It's almost Napoleonic in its crowdedness. Only the weapons are such. For instance, the estimate is that if the 170 millimeter guns that are pointed at Seoul, which is probably the fourth or fifth largest metropolitan population zone in the world, with 25 million people, that even though a quarter of those shells would probably, because they're so old, come in as duds, the other 75% of the shells, it's estimated, will cause 30,000 casualties in the first volley.
Jeez. Just
the first round. And the rounds will be coming in by the thousands. So you have a 700 plane Air Force versus another 700 plane Air Force. You have Kim Jong-un talking about something to about 4,000 Scud missiles tipped with sarin that he would saturate all the airports and ports and bases with and cause confusion. Anyway, that could be a bluff, and that's the thing I also talk about, is that the secret weapon of North Korea is the bluff. And Trump, being a negotiator, seems to have recognized that and has done something that I've been writing for years I thought was the way to really break through to possibly a diplomatic solution. You finally understand the Kim dynasty's language, and you double the bluff so that bluff can no longer be used, because here's one of the myths. A communist Stalinist leader is an atheist. And you will find that atheists do not wish to throw their lives away, because unlike so many people who believe in theism, and especially a lot of people who fight for ISIS, they're ready to throw their lives away cheaply because they believe, whether true or not, that they're going to paradise.
Right.
And so atheistic leaders, Stalin, Mao, if you look at their history, and the Kims, they're not people who want to throw things away. So here's another myth. The myth that it's an unstable, erratic, any moment going to collapse regime. You've got to remember that since 1945, Kim Il-sung has had the first of the Kims and then the other two that followed him.
His son and then his son.
Yeah. It is one of the longest-lasting regimes in modern history. That's pretty stable. Now, they act crazy, but if they really were crazy, they would have been gone a long time.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. This guy does act a little whacked out.
Well, so does Trump sometimes. It may be for effect. One thing's for sure, the facts are the facts. No matter how many threats he's made to jump and take the Korean Peninsula off the ledge with him, it has not happened yet. And he always backs off. And in the book, I look at that and show how when Bluff, the first one to get wind of what he was after, was actually the recently impeached president of South Korea.
Yeah, that's right. And the new one, by the way, wants to have better relations with the North.
And this, and we'll just hold that thought first, because
all right,
before I want to say something, which I rarely do, something potentially positive in this situation, is that one of the most important myths that Americans need to know is that the armistice that was signed 64 years ago was done under threat by President Eisenhower, who said if they didn't come to the peace talks, Eisenhower would use atomic weapons on the Red Chinese and North Koreans, which created the existential fear of the nation, whether the citizens like the Kims or not. Everybody in North Korea knows, because it's a documented fact that's often not reminded to the American people. Governments of America, ever since 1950, when MacArthur asked Truman, and then for atomic weapons, didn't get them, but Eisenhower brought them publicly into the field. We have always reserved the right to use first-strike nuclear attacks on a non-nuclear nation called North Korea. And that the North Koreans took seriously, because we are serious about it. And why not? We're the only people so far that's actually launched bombs on cities, atomic weapons. No one else has done it yet. There's precedent. And so when the Soviet Union was existing, the North Koreans felt protected by the nuclear umbrella that was over them. When the Soviet Union collapsed, that's when they started building their own nuclear program, because they feel that, so when they test the bombs, what they're saying is, this is our only way to defend ourselves, because you people are threatening to irradiate and wipe 25 million of us out. And every year, now imagine this, picture, if you will, Canada and America are enemies. We've divided and we're enemies. And NATO and Russia and everybody is an alliance on the side of Canada. And let's say every year on the border with the United States, Canada has this huge military maneuvers that they call decapitation maneuvers, where they rehearse how at any moment they'll come in and kill all the Congress, kill the president, and kill the Supreme Court in Washington. And then, as Americans are all running around in panic without a government, they'll come in and occupy it and make it part of Canada. That is, in a variation, is exactly what the people of North Korea deal with every year for decades. Now, you don't have to like the way they are, and the way this man is a dictator. Half his people are starving to death because they're trying to create these bombs. But it's not one-sided. There's a reason why they're starving, and we're part of the problem, because basically, if you want to end this situation, the North Koreans are going to have some kind of assurances that we will promise never to attack them with atomic weapons or any other kind of weapons in turn for them stopping their nuclear program. Because they don't want to go, even though as much as they bluff it, they don't want to go all the way, because that's mutually assured destruction in a small regional context. And I'm not sure the Americans understand this. This is why I come back to the new president of South Korea. He has a chance to really bring this to I feel that as close as we are to a major war in Korea, we are equally close to a breakthrough, which may actually end the Korean War, which, by the way, has never ended. It was only in an armistice. And by the way, in 2013, when Kim Jong-un came into power, he actually ended the armistice. So we're basically, except for actual firing, we're back to square one, where there's not even an armistice since 2013. I bet most of your listeners don't know that. And I bet most of your listeners don't know that the South Koreans don't run the command and control of any war. That this war is really is waged between North Korea and the United States. The generals of South Korea do not run their own armies. The U.S. generals run all the armies. They will pass the orders. So it was one of the reasons why Kim Il-sung, the first Kim, invaded South Korea, is there was no such thing as North and South Korea. They were divided by military districts by the occupying forces of the Soviet Union, and America was invited to occupy the South, and then the Americans created a puppet nation with President Rhee, an American educated Korean politician and created the Republic of Korea. So they looked at that and said, my goodness, the Americans are making satellite nations. So that's one of the reasons why Kim Il-sung invaded it, to unite Korea and liberate it from becoming satellites. And of course, he was a communist, and we fought against it. But that's so, I'm trying to give your listeners, some the reasons of what are the motivations for this. The other thing too is that when this armistice, I read the armistice that was signed in 1953, and we broke it. The armistice said that we would have this end of cessation of hostilities, and then within several months, the parties would come together to start a peaceful solution to the Korean police action. And in that, it required that the foreign troops that are involved have to leave the Korean peninsula. The Red Chinese left. The Americans did not. So we broke it. Mm-hmm. You won't be told that.
What does prophecy say, John, about all of this? I mean, can you predict what could happen?
Well, the thing that concerns me, first off, as you know, my expertise in prophecy, one of the unique things I say is, in my experience, there's nothing written in stone. We are predictable, and it looks like it's written in stone. I've said that often over the years.
But we can change. We can change prophecy.
So
right?
what I'm about to say, as terrifying as it is something that doesn't need to happen.
Okay, that's good to know.
But I tell you, it's again going back to the axis of evil, the triumvirate of terror prophecies of Nostradamus, which saw this 400 plus years before George Bush recited the speech. If it goes that round, and if the Eastern kings are completely overwhelmed, meaning North Korea, then we have that Korean War. We have that war where the Korean people might suffer 3.5 million casualties in one fortnight that took 3 years to kill and wound in a 3-year war every week. And it might last for 6 months. You will effectively take out one of the major economies of the world, disrupting the other major second or first economy. Now it's hard to tell anymore, and that's China. You will also set into motion the Barbare prophecies, which I've been talking to you about, where either Korea or war in the Middle East drags the United States and the Russians, rather than being friends and helping each other defeat ISIS and other groups, are barbare, that's the term he uses, which is an anagram for from or of the Arab satrapy, or the henchmen, the vassals. They rebel against their masters, and in so doing create such a mess that you have Russia and America suddenly waging a thermonuclear war.
Oh, gosh.
And one of the long or short countdowns that Nostradamus gives. The long countdown doesn't come up until 2027. But since it's supposed to be predated by a second Cold War between the Eagle Kings, who break up and are no longer friends, they go to war in either 3 years and 7 months or 13 years. So you have to start counting where it begins. I started counting with the beginning of the sanctions and counter-sanctions for what happened in the Ukrainian Civil War and what happened with Crimea, and how it became a full-fledged Cold War in April of 2014, which means, looking at the way the stars are going and all, between now and November, we are at the highest danger since the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Yom Kippur War in 1973 to having a direct confrontation with the Russians. And to give you an example of how sordid all of this is, the vassal situation, for instance, right now, Raqqa, we've just sent a lot of heavy equipment to the YPG Kurds who have taken much of northern Syria as their new nation. They're going to go into Raqqa, the capital of ISIS, with hundreds of U.S. troops helping. They're going to fight another major urban battle. And the Turks are very angry about us giving them the weapons, because the Turks, as they've been sending a few shells into ISIS positions, are sending twice as many into the YPG lines, because they're afraid that the YPG being independent will create a greater Kurdistan and a third of Turkey will be lost. So here's how your allies rebel against each other. You have us fighting alongside Iranian advisors in the Battle of Mosul in Iraq, but the same Iranian advisors who work with Hezbollah, who are allied to Syria, we're fighting them. We have our surrogate bombing them in Syria, Israel. And you also have the situation of that whenever it seems like Assad is winning his civil war, some incident happens.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So you see, I could go on, and the book goes into this in detail, but this is a web of multiple alliances with a lot of shady, it depends on where you're standing in the Middle East, whether your friend is shooting at you or arming you.
Stay with us, John. We're going to come back, talk more about this, and take phone calls in the